Okay. Very well. Okay. All right. Very well. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So as we talk about the Book of Kings, hold on one second. Sorry. Okay. So we'll talk about the Book of Kings, as is was the case when we talked about the Book of Samuel last week. The Book of Kings is a single book. So the division into two parts occurs first in the Septuagint, where it's known as Third and Fourth Kingdoms. So it's not until the 15th century AD or so that the Hebrew text was divided into two sections. So for Jerome, for example, the Book of Kings was a unity. So he states that the fourth book in the prophets is Malachim, just transliterating the Hebrew title into Latin. The English title, Kings, of course, does follow the traditional Hebrew designation Malachim, and not that of the Septuagint, which has third and fourth kingdoms. So the unity of both sections is still evident in Hebrew Bibles today, where you have the final Masorah reveals the total number of verses. So where it has the total verses of the book, singular, is 1,534. The midpoint is 1 Kings 22, verse 6. And the total number of the Sedarim is 35, which of course includes both of what we call First and Second Kings. So clearly the Masoretes reading this also as a single book. Again, as we talked about before with the Torah and other large books of the Bible, they were divided up into multiple scrolls for, quote unquote books, multiple scrolls, really for making it easier for practical purposes for scroll production and also for scroll handling, so use of scrolls. And so, but we see that they're reading this as a single literary unit. The unity of both sections of Kings is still evident in as also. So, for example, really, as we look at the arbitrariness of this division into two parts, that can be seen by the fact that the reign of Ahaziah, for example, is divided into two. So you have his ascendancy to the throne, recounted in 1 Kings 22, and his death is recounted there in 2 Kings chapter 1. So it splits right up, right in the middle of his reign before his death. Furthermore, the ministry of Elijah begins in 1 Kings 17 and ends with his ascension to heaven in 2 Kings chapter 2. So that's divided into two by this secondary division as well. And as we're going to look at here, really there's a concentric structure there that unites both what we call First and Second Kings into one unified text. And so, all right, so as we talk about some links here, so we're going to be looking at this as a single literary unit here. We talk about some links between Isaiah and Kings. I don't think I actually have some notes on this. I didn't finish this slide, so I apologize. But I do want to mention some links between Isaiah and the Book of Kings. So in 2 Kings 25:27, we read about how the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is raised up from the prison. He's put on a throne above all the kings who are with him there in Babylon. They're in exile. And not coincidentally, Isaiah chapter 1, immediately following, begins with a superscription that identifies the oracles as concerning Judah, right? So we have the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, raised up. And of course, we have these oracles concerning Judah there in Isaiah 1 and Jerusalem during the days of Uzziah. Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Again, all four of those kings are kings of Judah, according to the text, and they are found in 2 Kings chapters 15 through 20. So clearly the discussion concerning Judah's royal house has not ceased at the end of Kings. And the elevation of Jehoiakim further hints that this demise and exile is not the final word. In fact, the name Jehoiakim means Yahweh establishes. And so ultimately, we see that this is not the end of the discussion here. So Isaiah goes on to mention a root and a stem of Jesse in Isaiah 11, which will rule over the nations. And in conjunction with his rule will occur the restoration, the regathering of Israel and Judah, according to Isaiah 11. So the return from Assyria of the remnant of Israel is compared to the exodus from Egypt there in 11:16. You could also mention in Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, or verses 5 and 6, if you're looking at the Masoretic text counting. Looking there in Isaiah 9, the prophecy of how there's going to be a divine son who will rule on the throne of David forever. So you've got this glorious hope for those who have just read 2 Kings 25 in despair, right? The house of David is in exile, right? And now all of a sudden, look at these promises, this hope, and there's going to be this one who's going to sit on the throne of David forever in the book of Kings. So as a result, any doubt that is engendered by the events there at the end of the book of Kings, namely 2 Kings 25 and the exile, that is amply refuted by Isaiah's prophecies, which immediately follow. In fact, a narrative from 2 Kings 18, verse 13 through 20, verse 21, which includes prophecies by Isaiah that were fulfilled, are repeated for the most part in Isaiah 36 through 39. So we've got these parallels, these parallel passages there provide another undeniable link between these two books, between Isaiah and Kings. And they also imply that they be read in conjunction with each other, right? This intertextuality. So if Isaiah was accurate in his former prophecies, the idea is that he will be in those yet to come as well. So this small glimmer of hope that I talked about last week, I mentioned, the house of David is in exile. It's this dark, tragic moment in the life of the nation there. What has become of the promises of God? Is he not able? Is he not willing? And so we had Jehoiakim raised up there, this glimmer of hope, this flicker, this hope, of hope there in 2 Kings 25, there at the end. And now all of a sudden it's fanned into this conflagration here, just this raging flame here of prophecies, if you will, in Isaiah, which in fact reveal much more than what even the original covenant in 2 Samuel does with what David had expressed there. And so we see this further unpacking of the Davidic covenant here in the book of Isaiah and God's purposes for the house of David and the one who will come and sit on the throne of David. So one would have expected that Jeremiah, with its identical conclusion to that of 2 Kings 25, would have been appended to it, placed right after it. But instead, it is Isaiah, which concludes with a heavenly restored Jerusalem that follows. So, so we've got the placing of Isaiah next to Kings is not only chronological, certainly we see that, where Isaiah picks up there with the destroyed Jerusalem and the hope of this restoration there, but also provides a thematic link there between the hope for the house of David there at 2 Kings 25, and of course that same hope that is expounded upon in great detail in Isaiah chapters 1 through 12. That immediately following description of this desolate Jerusalem, when you open up to Isaiah chapter 1, we have this description of a desolate Jerusalem there. And so that provides a close link to the previous chapter there at the end of the book of Kings, immediately preceding Isaiah, where Jerusalem has been destroyed. Um, so, interestingly enough, Isaiah also speaks immediately of a coming restoration of that city there in Isaiah 2, the first 4 verses there. And he speaks of this coming restoration of the city in the last days, and he does so in eschatological proportions as well. So all the nations will stream to it to learn from the God of Jacob. And it's going to be there where the nations are judged. In fact, war, such as had been seen in 2 Kings 25, right, and the exile and so on, will occur no more. And Isaiah 4, verses 2 through 6, paints another picture of a restored Zion. Isaiah 65 as well furthers the description of a restored Jerusalem. Also, we see in Isaiah 40, verse 2, for example, at one of the important junctures of the book, the Lord speaks words of comfort directly to Jerusalem once again. So, from beginning to end, the city of Jerusalem in the past and future is at the forefront of interest for the author of Isaiah. And so, such a message follows quite appropriately the desolated state of the city at the end of the book of Kings. So, one of the few commentaries on Kings, which even discusses the significance of the canonical placement of that book, is that of House, his New American Commentary. And I'm going to read you a quote here where he talks about the overall sequence here of the former and latter prophets here. So I'm going to read a quote here from him. He says, quote, "The Hebrew Bible places Joshua through Kings." So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the former prophets. The Hebrew Bible places Joshua through Kings with the prophets, which highlights their common viewpoints. This decision implies that the book of Kings is being treated as proclamation and history. This is prophetic history, in other words. It also underlines the book of Kings' belief that Israel's prophets should have been heeded. Both traditions, what he's talking about is the Hebrew canon, the shape of the canon, Torah, Prophets, and Writings, and the Greek Alexandrian canon, which our modern English Bibles follow. He says both traditions, both canonical traditions, tell Israel's story, but the Hebrew canon gives the story more bite by following it with a parade of the very people who warned that destruction was coming. On the one hand, they provide the tragic end of Israel's national story, a story that begins in Genesis. On the other hand, they introduce readers to the extensive prophetic influence in Israel, provide a prophetic interpretation of the nation's history. You guys pick up on that? So on the other hand, they introduce readers to the extensive prophetic influence in Israel. They provide a prophetic interpretation of the nation's history, right? This is not just narrative, not just historical narrative, just simply recounting these historical events, but it provides a prophetic interpretation. And so this is theological, it is prophetic. And so we have prophetic history here. And so it says it provides a prophetic interpretation of the nation's history and thereby paves the way for the messages found in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. I thought it was a good observation here as you look at the former prophets, this prophetic history, as it gives this prophetic interpretation of the nation's history there, and of course followed up by the parade of these prophets who warned them of the destruction to come. So, all right, let's see here. I'm going to all right, let's go ahead and talk about the literary structure here a little bit of Kings. There's a lot of things that we can talk about, but I'm going to be selective here tonight. So we've talked about the literary structure here. Now, let me just mention a couple things real quick about authorship and date before I do that, and we'll get into the literary structure there. So the final form of the Book of Kings must have been written during the exile to Babylon in the 6th century BC, due to the fact, or at least no earlier than that, due to the fact that the last event in the book is, of course, the release from prison of Jehoiakim. So at the least, at the earliest, it's going to be the final form of it. Can't occur before that. So it's got to be at least during the exilic period there for that. So Evil-Merodach is the Babylonian monarch there who grants this favor to Jehoiakim. And so that's there in the 6th century BC. So the name there, Evil-Merodach, he ran there around 562, 560 BC. His name reads Amel Marduk in Akkadian and means man of Marduk. And of course, in Hebrew, the term Evil means foolish, rendering the foolish one of Marduk. So that's the title given there. Jehoiakim enjoyed his release and the royal sustenance, the provision there, all the days of his life. So since he became king at age 18 and only reigned 3 months in Jerusalem before falling to Nebuchadnezzar, you had several deportations there, and so that was around 597 BC. The 37th year of exile for him would be approximately 560 BC. And so his age would be roughly 55 years at the time of his release from prison. And if he lived another 20 years to the age 75, the end of his life would have fallen roughly around 540 BC or so. And so that's a year before the fall of Babylon to the Persians in 539 BC. Now, this type of scenario, by the way, would explain why the writer failed to mention any return from exile, as is found in Chronicles or in Ezra, Nehemiah, for example. So while this is likely found its final shape during the exilic period and not in the post-exilic period, perhaps. So you would expect some kind of reference to the return. So if Jehoiakim dies sooner, the omission of any return would also be logical, but if he outlived the Babylonian Empire, it would be difficult to explain why the events of 539 BC were omitted, especially considering the conditions there. So, unless, of course, I mean, and it's possible the final writer of Kings did not live past the exile, right? And it is still possible that the final shaper there could have been after the exile, after the returns, and simply chose not to for the purposes of the book. So it could be that if the redactor, the final canonical shaper of Kings, sought to emphasize, right, it could be that if he sought to emphasize the fact that God's promises to Israel were not fulfilled in the return of 539 BC, but rather in a yet unseen restoration, then the omission of Cyrus's decree could have been deliberate. So that's possible as well. So the placement of Isaiah as the immediately following text really seems to stress that idea even more. So the restoration of the Davidic monarchy that is hinted at there at the end of the book of Kings with the elevation of Jehoiakim there in exile is not to be seen. That restoration that's hinted at there is not to be seen in the return of Zerubbabel, but rather in the prophecies of Isaiah, really in particular chapters 6 through 12. So that would fit well. So just a few comments to make there on authorship, dating, timing there. So again, not sure exactly who the author is. As far as the literary structure of the Book of Kings, just kind of a few observations here on a purely chronological level. If I'm just talking about just dividing it up chronologically, you can divide it up into three eras. So first, you have the United Monarchy under Solomon at the beginning of Kings. So First Kings 1 through 11. You got the divided monarchy. So the northern and southern kingdoms there after Solomon's rule, of course. You guys are familiar. His son Rehoboam does not listen to the wise counsel, but rather listens to his yes men. And so we had this division there. The people didn't take too kindly to that. And so you've got the kingdom dividing there. Rehoboam maintains the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And you've got Jeroboam, who takes the 10 tribes the northern kingdom, that is Israel. And so we see the divided monarchy there from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 17. And then a focus on the southern kingdom there, which remains, right? So you've got the exile of the northern kingdom during the Assyrian rule there around 722 BC. And then you've got the southern kingdom that the text then focuses on from 2 Kings 18 to 25 until, of course, the Babylonian exile, when the house of David is removed there from Jerusalem and is in exile. So that's really the three major eras. So it's pretty easy to kind of break that up. The monarchy and its final stages of the monarchy under Solomon, the divided kingdom there up to the end of the northern kingdom, that is Israel, the exile by the Assyrians, and then, of course, the latter part with the southern kingdom until they're exiled to Babylon. So that's just on a strictly chronological level there, as we talk about the major eras there in the Book of Kings. So not only that, though, as in the previous books we've looked at, for example, in Judges and Samuel, the literary structure does reveal more of the author's agenda than simply looking at a bare chronology, right? If we're to look at the structure, I'll just go ahead and get all this up here for you. I see a nice structure here. And so notice here, you've got this nice chiastic structure there. The beginning there of Kings, you have the Davidic dynasty that has begun, and the temple is built and dedicated there in Jerusalem. And of course, on the other end, bookending the Book of Kings, what do we have? We have the end of the Davidic dynasty there in the land. The temple is profaned, restored, and ultimately it is destroyed. So that's bookending. That's a nice bookend around the book. Then B there, the northern kingdom is founded, of course. You have the idolatry of Jeroboam, not unlike the idolatry there in the Torah, right? There at Sinai. So certainly recalling that. And of course, the northern kingdom has all the wicked kings there. And so they go into exile first. But you have the northern kingdom founded in the idolatry of Jeroboam. Again, on the other end there, you've got in 2 Kings 17, the northern kingdom destroyed because of Jeroboam's idolatry. C and C1 there, you've got alternating kings in the north and south discussed. And then again, alternating kings in the north and south in 2 Kings 10 through 16. And there at the central portion of the Book of Kings, which should be a surprise, are these great paragons, these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, who, of course, contend against Baal worship, in particular against Ahab and Jezebel. And so we've got these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, this narrative there at the heart, the central portion of the Book of Kings. And of course, all of this is bookended by the building of the temple, the Davidic dynasty, and what becomes of the temple and the Davidic dynasty at the end of the book. So that frames the whole book with this climax there in the beginning, in the central portion, with the narratives regarding Elijah and Elisha. So I want to make some comments here about the temple and the dynasty, the bookends around the book. So at both extremes of this book, right, we've got an emphasis on David's line and the temple. So David dies in 1 Kings chapter 2 after he hands over power to his son Solomon, while in 2 Kings 25, his descendant Jehoiakim is taken as a young man to Babylon, where he's imprisoned there in exile. However, the Davidic line, nonetheless remained intact, even if it was not in power. Right? So for the writer of the Book of Kings, Jehoiakim's elevation under Evil-Merodach keeps alive the hope that's put in God's promise to David back in 2 Samuel 7 at the heart of the Book of Samuel, where he gives this hope, this promise there of an eternal dynasty or house. So indeed, right, the house that God built for David, according to 2 Samuel 7, 11 through 16, endured. And I want to say this again, the house that God built for David, according to 2 Samuel 7, endured, while the house that Solomon built for God was destroyed. So gold was used by Solomon to overlay the temple, as we see described there in 1 Kings chapter 6. We also see in 2 Kings 24, that same gold. Note how Solomon's name is repeated there. That gold was taken by Nebuchadnezzar. The bronze pillars, the sea, the pots, the instruments there in 2 Kings 25 are given special prominence, even when they're carried off by the Babylonians, in order to match the same description that's given at the beginning there of the book of Kings, as early as 1 Kings chapter 7, of those same utensils and vessels. So you see that occurring there again. So you've got this description of the spoliation of the temple, according to one scholar there, these vessels there in the book of Kings, which corresponds to the order of their manufacture back in 1 Kings 7. So you got all the work, all the glory of Solomon and his temple there was for naught. It was for nothing because of his and his son's rebellion. All right, so you could sum it up. The final destruction of the temple in 2 Kings 25 is followed by the note in verses 27 through 30, confirming that this scion, this descendant of David, is still alive in Babylon. So any thought of abandoning hope after this absolute disaster, this devastation of exile that was brought about by Nebuchadnezzar because of Israel's sin, right? It's tempered nonetheless by this final positive note, this glimmer of hope at the end of Kings. So included in these two units that surround the bulk of the book of Kings is a further inclusio by means of the idea of exile. So Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8, right? You have the dedication of the temple there, and you have Solomon's prayer. They're very fascinating as you go back and read through Solomon's prayer. But his prayer in 1 Kings 8 included the possibility of exile, and in similar fashion to Moses and Joshua before. So it includes the possibility of exile, in particular in verses 46 through 51. And so it comes to pass at the end of the book of Kings. So we see that as well. So the same prayer of Solomon raised the possibility not only of the exile, but also that of restoration, which is not explicitly mentioned at the conclusion of Kings, but it is hinted at through the elevation of Jehoiakim there in Babylon over all the other kings at that point. So as it stands, the book of Kings implies a certain uneasiness, if you will, regarding Israel's hold on the land right from the start. We see that back in the end of the Torah. We see that in Joshua. We see it at the start here as well, as this inclusio of exile also intimates that idea here in the book of Kings. Also, going to the next points there, B and B1 there, the northern kingdom founded, and then the northern kingdom destroyed. We had the idolatry of Jeroboam, and of course, because of his idolatry, that was followed by those that came after. So, following Solomon's death, right, again, the nation was divided into two, right, the northern part under the rule of Jeroboam. Now, although God promised Jeroboam the northern kingdom and warned him to walk in obedience, what did he do? And that was 1 Kings 11, by the way. What does he do? As I already alluded to earlier, he sets up the golden calves there in Dan and Bethel, according to 1 Kings chapter 12. And so, again, reminding the reader of the idolatry there in the Torah, there at Mount Sinai. So it was precisely for this reason that the northern kingdom was finally destroyed and exiled by the Assyrians in 722 BC. And so the narrator mentions this sin of Jeroboam there in 2 Kings chapter 17, in fact. So the sins of Jeroboam are followed by all the kings of the north, as the narrator repeatedly states. So likewise, all the kings in the south are judged according to the faithfulness, not the disobedience of their father and founder, David. So that's the standard for the kings, the southern kingdom. So the model of David, if you will, was clearly better than that of Jeroboam. We had then as well C and C1. So on either side of this long narrative that we see at the center, right, where we see the prophets Elijah and Elisha dominate the central portion there, we have here in the text a succession of narratives recounting kings either from the north or the south. However, these are by no means the only prophets who appear in the book. So, as noted already, each northern kingdom falls under the condemnation of the following the sins of Jeroboam. the founder of the northern kingdom. So in the south, David's descendants are also judged in light of his example, with most of them falling short, but there were some good kings, if you will. So even Jeroboam, the founder of the northern kingdom, is judged after the model of David, according to 1 Kings 14. And of course, he fails, utterly fails. Solomon loves Yahweh. He loves the Lord as his father David did. However, Solomon sacrifices at the high places. We see that in 1 Kings 3, for example. Later on in chapter 11, we read that in Solomon's old age, he did not have a heart like David, even though he was warned accordingly by Yahweh in chapter 9. So in 1 Kings 15, we see that Aviam is also compared negatively to his father David, while Asa is given a mostly positive recommendation, except for the high places. The kings didn't always remove the high places. So the latter are a repeated accusation against the Judean kings there, not removing the high places. So Jehoshaphat is characterized in much the same way as Asa, his father, having failed to remove the high places. He also goes to war, and he does so allied with Ahab, the king of the north. We've got intermarriage between the north and the south also takes place, as noted in 2 Kings chapter 8. There we read that Ahaziah followed the ways of Ahab's house because he was related to them. It's been pointed out that Jehoram there in 2 Kings 8 is the last king of Judah to be granted favor, quote, for the sake of David, his servant, end quote. So that's a phrase that's repeated in earlier narratives as well in the Book of Kings. So this subsequent, what follows, the omission of that type of statement serves as really an ominous portent of the coming disaster for the line of David. So by the time we get to Jehoash in 2 Kings 12, we do not read of him being like David, but rather he did right as long as Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Again, he does not remove the high places. So his son Amaziah also did right, yet not like his father David, according to 2 Kings 14. And again, he doesn't remove the high places. Azariah, aka Uzziah, his son, does right, but again, fails to remove the high places, according to 2 Kings 15. And Uzziah is the one that we'll look at again, as we see a lot of intertextuality with him in Chronicles and the book of Isaiah, but we'll come back to him when we look at Isaiah. Jotham also does not remove the high places, according to 2 Kings 15. His son Ahaz does not do right as his father David, according to 2 Kings 16. And so when Israel is exiled in 2 Kings 17, Judah is also condemned at that point. Now, surprisingly, in 2 Kings 18, we read of Hezekiah being like his father David, and he removes the high places. So we have this description of his piety, right? It is quite positive in the text, but this is, of course, tempered nonetheless by the fact that he sends tribute to Assyria. Furthermore, his son Manasseh undoes all the good of his father, right? It only takes one generation. So it only takes one generation to change for good or bad. But Manasseh, his son, undoes all the good of his father and brings the same judgment upon Judah as that of Israel. So there's no reason to compare him with David because no resemblance is even, quite frankly, remotely possible with him. So his son Josiah is again like Hezekiah, doing like his father David, according to 2 Kings 22:2. He is the last of any good kings before Judah is exiled. So we kind of have the stay of execution of judgment there because of his faithfulness there. So although many kings of Judah receive evaluations without mentioning David, he is clearly the model and the prototypical king for Israel. So even David is qualified with the negative note, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So even with David, it doesn't gloss over these things. We see that in 1 Kings 15, there in reference to Aviam. So clearly, no king was ever faultless, right? And that includes David, and the text also notifies the reader of that as well. Even Josiah right? He falls in battle with Pharaoh Necho there in 2 Kings 23. And again, seems to be a rather cryptic notice after describing his exemplary life in which he restores worship there in Jerusalem and so on. Um, let's see. So let's get to the central portion there, the prophets Elijah and Elisha there. So I want to talk about these guys here quite a bit. So at the very center of the book of Kings, you got the succession by Elisha to the prophetic ministry of Elijah. So the time span of these two ministries is only about 40 years, but it covers 16 or more chapters of the book. So, and it comes at the heart of the book. So it covers less time than the rest of the book does, but it covers the most significant portion of the book as well. So coming at the heart of the book and being such an extended narrative really highlights the importance of these prophets for the book. In fact, prophets are ever present throughout the book of Kings, beginning with Nathan and extending through Ahijah, Shemaiah, Jehu, Elijah, Micaiah ben Imlah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jonah's mentioned, Huldah, and other anonymous prophets that are mentioned as well. So we've got a host of prophets that are present here in the book of Kings. So inevitably, these prophets are used to foretell events in the life of the nation of the monarch, just as Moses, Joshua, and Samuel prophesied the nation's future prior. So Moses had already enunciated the signs of a true prophet, according to Deuteronomy 18, in their midst. So only those whose words came to pass were, of course, ones that were sent by Yahweh, the true prophets. So you've got one scholar noted, quote, I'll give you here. The classic power struggle in kings is that between prophet and king. And the former, that is the prophet, is always shown to be the person of greater authority, even though political and military might resides with the monarch, end quote. So included among these prophets are Isaiah and Jonah, as I mentioned already. So Jonah prophesies in 2 Kings 14:25, the restoration of a border. Isaiah foresees the defeat of Sennacherib there in 2 Kings 19, for example. So those serve to prepare the canonical reader, if you will, for the future eschatological and the extended prophecies that we're going to see in the book of Isaiah, which follows the book of Kings here. And again, already affirming for the reader their reliability, if you will. So, since they had prophesied correctly in the short run, right, as what you see in Kings, right, their words concerning the distant, the remote future were also to be trusted. They were trustworthy. So the same is true for Jonah in the book of the 12. So this evidence reveals perhaps why the canonical division prophets includes what are ostensibly historical narratives. Again, we've talked about this being prophetic history. So I do want to mention here Elijah. Again, so it should come as no surprise here in the book of Kings that we see Elijah being presented in the mold of the prophet Moses here. And that is a particular interest in the book of Kings, the characterization of Elijah as another Moses. So we know canonically, right, depending on how you take it, there are those who will look at Deuteronomy 34:10 as a statement added later, perhaps in the time of Ezra, looking back over all the prophets who have come and gone, and that he never came, but he's coming. But nonetheless, even if you take it being earlier, that edition there, that final shape, still the anticipation of this one to come, as prophesied in Deuteronomy 18. So, as was the case that we saw already with Joshua, for example, and even Samuel as a prophet in the mold of Moses, Elijah also replicates much of what Moses accomplished, but again, he doesn't replace him. Right? Elijah is perhaps the major figure in the prophetic corpus, even as a whole. And so he's mentioned at the close of Malachi 3:23, even as Moses is mentioned at the close of the Torah in Deuteronomy 34, for example. So Elijah really plays a major role here in not just the book of Kings, at the central portion of the book of Kings, as he's going to be presented as a prophet in the mold of Moses, this is eschatological figure, but also really a central prophet in the prophetic corpus as a whole. So I'm going to look at some of these parallels there. If you guys see, Excuse me. So I'll go ahead and get started there. So number one, Moses went before Pharaoh to announce the plagues. And of course, Elijah announced the drought before Ahab. So they both go before, wicked rulers and make these announcements before them. Number two, Moses stretched out his, and I want you to follow even the progression here, all the details and the parallels here on number two. Moses stretches out his hand over the Red Sea. He parts the water, according to Exodus 14, also repeated in the poetic portion there of Exodus 15, right? So he stretches out his hand, parts the Red Sea, parts the water, as does his successor Joshua. He parts the Jordan River in the mold of Moses, right? Joshua then comes to Jericho first. Joshua is filled with the Spirit after Moses laid hands upon him. When you look at Elijah, he struck the waters of the Jordan River and they parted, again, echoing not only Joshua, but of course Moses as well, so that he and Elisha went to the other side. And not only that, his successor also, in this case it's Elisha, came back into the land after dividing the Jordan River. So Moses' successor, after him, divides the Jordan River. Elijah's successor, Elisha, also comes into the land, dividing the Jordan River as well. So Elisha immediately came to which city? The successor came to Jericho, the same city that Joshua went to. So Elijah throws his cloak on Elisha, and he exhibits the spirit of Elijah upon him. In fact, of course, he's given a double portion there in the book of Kings. I mean, that's quite remarkable, the parallels here that we see. So clearly the parting of the waters there, one of the more obvious parallels that you see there. Number three, and there are some other obvious ones that we'll see here. Moses dies mysteriously east of the Jordan. Remember, the text of the Torah, as we looked at in Deuteronomy 34, gives us some really specific details of that he was in perfectly fine health, but the Lord took him out there. And the Lord buried him there. So Moses dies mysteriously east of the Jordan without illness. His final resting place was unknown. And it says, until that day, nobody knew where it was. Right? So he stood high there on Mount Pisgah and looked out over the land, right? Now Elijah is taken mysteriously up into heaven, right, east of the Jordan, without any illness, and thus has no resting place as well that we know of. Number four, Moses and Israel are fed in the desert beyond the Jordan with manna in the morning and meat in the evening, miraculously, right? And water, according to Exodus 17. The manna and the meat does not give out. Right? So God miraculously feeds Moses and the people of Israel there in the wilderness. Elijah likewise was kept east of the Jordan, there in the wilderness, and ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. Well, that's pretty miraculous. I don't know about you guys, but I spent a lot of time at Grand Canyon. It doesn't take very long there, by the way. The ravens are known for coming in and taking food, and they like to eat whatever they get. So the fact here that we have ravens actually bringing him food instead of taking it from him, that's pretty miraculous. So he's got these ravens bringing food to Elijah there. So in the morning and evenings there. So the provision of water, and of course, immediately following that, you see the widow's jar of flour and oil did not give out, just as the manna and meat did not give out. Same thing there in conjunction with that narrative. Number five, fire from the Lord confirms Moses as the leader in number 16, the leader of Korah. And of course, you guys think of the fire from heaven, which confirms Elijah as the prophet of the one true God in 1 Kings 18 over the prophets of Baal and so on. Number six, Moses commands. So after he comes down from the mountain there, right, and sees the rebellion, the idolatry of the golden calf, right, Moses commands the Levites to kill those who worship the golden calf after asking those who are on Yahweh's side to come to him. Right? So they come to him and he has them kill them. Likewise, there at the end of the narrative there where the prophets of Baal, they even acknowledge, right, that Yahweh, he is God. He alone is God, right? After the fire of heaven comes down and consumes the altar, right? Licks up all the water and so on. But what does he do? He takes them down there by the brook and has them slaughtered, right? So he slaughters the prophets of Baal after asking them which God they will serve. Number 7, Moses fled from Pharaoh in Egypt in fear to Midian. Elijah fled from Jezebel in fear to Beersheba and then to the desert. So they both flee to the desert from these evil rulers. Number 8, Moses meets the messenger of the Lord at the burning bush, right? The Lord himself, Yahweh himself, speaks to him from the burning bush, which is not consumed there. And of course, that is at Mount Horeb, which is Sinai, according to the text. Well, so he's meeting him at the bush there. And Elijah meets the messenger of the Lord while under a broom tree. So, very interesting there is dealing with these plants and the meeting place there with God. Number 9, Moses was 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai without eating or drinking, according to Exodus 34, after commanding the Levites to slay these idolatrous Israelites in Exodus 32, right? And so here's another parallel following the narrative in 1 Kings 18. Elijah went 40 days and 40 nights in strength of food, but it mentions the 40 days and nights there, given to him by an angel. So again, miraculous provision there until he comes to where? To Horeb, again, the very mountain that Moses went to, Sinai. So now we have Elijah, this prophet and Moses, who goes to the very same mountain of God, and he does so after the slaying of the prophets of Baal, just as, of course, Moses slayed those idolatrous Israelites in Exodus 32. Number 10, the Lord descends with fire and an earthquake on the mountain there in Exodus 19. There at the beginning there, as the Sinai covenant was about to be established. And the parallel there, the Lord passes over the mountain with not a fur, that's a typo, with a fire and an earthquake, according to 1 Kings 19. And he's there at the same mountain. Mount Sinai is where Elijah's at. Number 11, Moses stood in the cleft of the rock on the mountain and watched God's glory go by, according to Exodus 33. And likewise, Elijah slept in a cave on the mountain, the same mountain, and saw the Lord pass by, according to 1 Kings 19. Number 12, the book of Joshua, of course, which follows the Torah, narrates Moses' deeds narrates his deeds, Joshua's deeds, as parallel to those of his predecessor Moses. So that is the successor. His deeds are likened to Moses. Likewise, the Elisha narratives portray him with the deeds parallel to those of his predecessor Elijah. So not only directly between Moses and Elijah, but even their successors, Joshua and Elisha. We see those parallels there and connections there. Number 13, Aaron and Israel make a golden calf to worship, according to Exodus 32. Of course, that's an idolatry that is opposed vehemently by Moses. Vehemently. Likewise, Israel worshiped 2 golden calves. It's almost like they were double the idolatry under Jeroboam, right? They set up the golden calves there in Bethel and Dan, directly paralleling what happened there in the Exodus here. It's like they've gone from bad to worse, and they don't learn. And so now they've got golden calves set up in 2 places there in the land of all places. And of course, they set up these golden calves there in Bethel and Dan, and later Baal. And of course, this is opposed likewise by Elijah. So we see a number of parallels here with Elijah, these clear ideas and themes that are picked up there in the experience of Elijah there that directly recall for the reader this prophet Moses. All right. So both Moses, let me continue on there. Both Moses and Elijah were generally opposed by the people and their leaders as well. Interestingly enough, right? So, and in fact, you say both Moses and Elijah as ones who were generally opposed by the people and their leaders. In fact, Moses dealt quite a bit with opposition, as does Elijah. So both of these really foreshadow a future Moses, which is expected since Deuteronomy 18:34, as we've seen. And so it would be expected then, you would think, that the future prophet like Moses would also be rejected by the nation and its leadership. All right, so I think that's the idea that we do see. And so Moses had spoken of a prophet like himself, right, in Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18, of this one who would rise up to speak God's words. At the end of the Torah, there in Deuteronomy 34:10, we're told that no prophet like Moses had yet arisen, who knew Yahweh face to face, and who had done all the signs in Egypt that he had done. However, Joshua, who is presented in the immediately preceding verse, Deuteronomy 34:9, as Moses' successor, and who acts like Moses in the following book, is nonetheless not the awaited prophet. So in the case of Elijah, we see a major prophet who resembles Moses in numerous instances, but nevertheless, he does not qualify either as the prophet according to Deuteronomy 34:10 and Deuteronomy 18 prior. So Elijah, in fact, will come again in the eschatological day of Malachi 3:23. I'm getting the Masoretic counting there. And so Elijah is going to come again in the eschatological day of Malachi 3 to prepare the way for the coming of the Lord. Right? So apparently he prepares the way for the coming of the divine messenger of Malachi 3. That divine messenger appears again in Psalm 1 and 2 as the blessed man, the royal son of God, who destroys the wicked, there in Psalm 1 and 2. And so notice the parallel vocabulary. Again, there's a lot of parallel vocabulary between Malachi 3. Again, there's only 3 chapters in the Masoretic text there. Same content, different division of chapters. So you got the parallel vocabulary further between Malachi 3 and Psalm 1 and 2, which creates this canonical continuity between the end of the prophets and the beginning of the writing. So you've got judgment of fire, the righteous versus the wicked, the chaff, the stubble, the statutes, and so on. So really, as a result there, these figures resemble Moses, right? But only serve to point to another beyond them, all who, according to Deuteronomy 34:10, have not come. But he's coming. And so Elijah presents another interesting figure there, especially with what we see there at the end of the prophets there with Malachi. And so again, as I mentioned here, at the heart of the book of Kings here, we have this prophet Elijah, who is a central prophet, not just in this book, but in the prophetic corpus as a whole. And we see him again there at the end of the book, the end of the prophetic corpus there in Malachi. All right. So not only that, we've got Elisha as a second Elijah. As Joshua was a prophet in the mold of Moses, here we see Elisha following in the same vein as Elijah. So before his departure to heaven, Elijah was asked for a double portion of his spirit by Elisha there in 2 Kings chapter 2. And it seems that he was apparently granted this request since he saw the departure a few verses later. That's in 2:12. So as the narrative unfolds, this extra portion, excuse me, this extra portion of power is revealed by the double number of miracles that we see in Elisha's ministry. And so I've got that on the on this slide here. So we see a double portion of the spirit of Elisha, and if you go the spirit of Elijah on Elisha, and so you've got the miracles of Elijah there mentioned in the left-hand column there, and essentially you've got twice the amount of miracles that are recorded there with Elisha there, which seems to confirm that he indeed, as observing Elijah going to heaven, that he indeed received that double portion. Without going into all of those at this point. So I'm going to go back here real quick to not only does Elisha double the miracles of his predecessor, Elijah, he also repeats many of them, as did Joshua, repeating many of his predecessor, Moses. So as we look at them, number one, Elijah saves a widow and her son from starvation. Elisha saves a widow and her son from slavery. Elijah, number two, you had this woman who complains about the death of her son. And then likewise, we have the woman complaining about the death of her son in 2 Kings 4. Elijah, what does he do? He stretches out on the dead child 3 times, raising him from the dead. And that's what Elisha does, slightly different here, but he also raises a child from the dead. So he crouches over a dead child twice, raising him from the dead. They're both raising people from the dead now. Number 4, this is interesting. Elijah being a hairy man, gotta love the description there. He calls down fire on 100 men of Ahaziah who commanded him to come down. And this is a pretty awesome, in fact, you know what? I think I want to read it real quick. It's just kind of fun to read some of this. So in 2 Kings 17, excuse me, 2 Kings, 1, 2 through 17. So now Ahaziah fell through the lattice of his upper room, etc., etc. Going to go down to. He said, verse 7. Then he said to them, "What kind of man was it who came up to meet you and told you these words?" So they answered him, "A hairy man wearing a leather belt around his waist." And he said, and of course the king knew, "It is Elijah the Tishbite." So then the king sent to him a captain of 50 with his 50 men. So he went up to him, and there he was, sitting on the top of a hill. And he spoke to him, "Man of God, the king has said, come down." So Elijah answered and said to the captain of 50, "If I am a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Then he sent to him another captain of 50. I'd be a little wary of that. I wouldn't want to do that. So the king sends another captain of 50 with his 50 men. And he answered and said to him, "Man of God, thus has the king said, come down quickly." So Elijah answered and said to them, "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Again, he, the king, doesn't seem to learn, sent a third captain of 50 with his 50 men. And notice what the third one does. He's learning the lesson here. And the third captain of 50 went up and came and fell on his knees before Elijah and pleaded with him and said to him, "Man of God, please let my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. Look, fire has come down from heaven and burned up the first two captains of 50s with their 50s, but let my life now be precious in your sight." And the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So he arose and went down with him to the king. Then he said to him, "Thus says the Lord, because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baalzebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die." So Ahaziah died according to the word of the Lord which Elijah had spoken, because he had no son. Jehoram became king in his place in the second year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Well, that's quite a powerful story there. So you've got this hairy man, interesting description there, calls down fire on 100 men. Then you've got, of course, with Elisha, you got these youths making fun of him for being bald, right? So the moral of the story there, don't make fun of bald men. Is that? That's not the moral of the story. But anyways, you see there in 2 Kings 2, they're making fun of him. And what does he do? He command these bears come down and destroy them. And so reading there, beginning, I'm going to, so then Elisha, went up from there to Bethel, verse 23 of chapter 2. And as he was going up the road, some youths came from the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." So he turned around and looked at them. I can only imagine the look that he gave them. So he turned around and looked at them and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. And two female bears, so two she bears, if you will, came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. Then he went from there to Mount Carmel. I like that, just kind of matter of fact. Then he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. Right, just another day in the life of the prophet. So interesting, the parallels here, the description of a hairy man, a bald man, and how the Lord uses them to bring judgment on these men. Number 6, you've got the Spirit upon Elijah, and of course, the parallel, the double portion of that same Spirit upon Elisha. Number 7, you've got Elijah, as I've already mentioned before, who strikes the waters of the Jordan River and parting the water. Elisha does the same thing. He parts the waters of the Jordan River as well. So clear parallel there. Number 8, at the departure of Elijah, his successor cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its riders," in 2 Kings 2:12. Well, at the death of Elisha, guess what? The same thing is stated for him. King Joash of Israel states, my father, the chariots of Israel and its riders." So we see a number of parallels here between Elijah and Elisha as well here at the heart of the book of Kings. So I'm going to stop it there at this point. There's much more that can be said about the portrayal of the kings, the presentation of David, and so on. But for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and I think stop it here. Any thoughts or questions or just any observations at this point?
I'm curious, could you talk for a minute about the significance of this? The parallels, I mean, they're remarkable, to say the least, but what's the significance of that, do you think?
Well, yeah, ultimately, that's the author is keeping before the reader the eschatological hope. There's the anticipation from the beginning of Scripture of this one who's to come, and now, of course, at the end of the Torah, this prophet like Moses. So Elijah is elevated to this very clear status that seems to be clearly confirmed intertextually, canonically speaking, there in Malachi, for example, right? So Elisha, again, just as Joshua follows Moses, you have the same, the parallels that extend beyond just between Moses and Elijah to even their successors as well. So again, it's a central portion here, just this clear presentation, this before the reader, right? That there's this continued work of God. He is faithful, raising up for these generations there. And keeping before the reader this hope. So for me, that's what I would say would be the ultimate takeaway. Although there are other things that can be said, certainly.
Yeah, I'm the all that you said is good, is proper, but I'm still wondering, for instance, there's these the comparisons between Moses and Elijah, and then all these amazing parallels. So what does the author, why is the author noting these parallels? Why is that? It seems like so much of the text is made up of these these comparisons between these two that go beyond, or they do not seem to be part of the thesis of showing a hope to come. They just seem to be unique. But I was wondering, I guess, authorally,
They seem to be what?
they're unique. I mean, they're obvious, but I don't quite see the connection, to the purpose of the author in arranging or writing these stories so that there's the hairy man Elijah, and then there's the bald man Elijah. And they obviously parallel each other, as many of the ones that you noted, but I missed the reason for those. Why is the author organizing his story so that there are all of these various parallels? It doesn't seem to relate to the topic of the demise of of Israel, and the communicating of the hope that lies beyond. It seems peripheral to that. It doesn't seem necessary to communicate that thesis.
Yeah, I don't see it as peripheral. I see it as clearly keeping before the reader that hope. This prophet like Moses in particular, but also the prophets are also prophesying in their day and time based on the Mosaic covenant, calling people back to the right covenant relationship. They're dealing with that aspect, which we see prior as well in the prophets. But we also see on the other level there, if you will, this presentation of the prophets themselves being that hope. And again, I think Malachi also gives further support for such a notion of this presentation of Elijah.
What I might add, Don, if it's any consolation, is that recently preached on 1 Kings 19, where Elijah has ran, to Sinai. And I remember noting some of these parallels. But I too kind of, as I was standing trying to share that observation, I was kind of still nagging a little bit why, like what's the significance for it. And frankly, it felt like it kind of was a flat moment in the sermon when I tried to point it out. Perhaps it was my fault. But what I can just say in what may help me see the significance of this is zeroing in on Deuteronomy 18, where it is kind of explicit that, as I'm seeing this, it's explicit that a prophet like Moses has to arise. Did the Deuteronomy text suggest that there had to be a fulfillment of every single thing of Moses' life? No. And so, do we have to have all this to make the claim? No. But it's interesting. I still might be a little bit skeptical about some of them, like you're kind of coming from. But if I zero in and remember that Deuteronomy says a prophet like Moses has to come, that makes this a little more potentially pregnant with the hope that, we're being told is there.
Thank
All
you,
right, any
Jacob.
other thoughts,
Appreciate that.
comments, questions? All right, and so that's just kind of a flyby, very selective presentation just for time's sake. So we're going to do this. We're going to take about a 5-minute break now. It's 7:15. So let's just reconvene here in about 5 minutes. And again, just real quick, we're going to go through your Hebrew text, looking at those passages in Samuel. And this is where I'm going to give you guys the opportunity. I've already given the introductory talk on it. So based on what you've read, based on your own research and looking at the Hebrew text here, I'm going to give you guys some latitude here to discuss some things and ask questions and work through some issues that you guys want to do. So this will be much of what you guys make it here. So take advantage of that. That's what I'm saying. Okay. I'll see you guys here in about 5 minutes. Yeah, Hoy, how's your family doing?
They're doing good. Four of us at different 4 places.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. So you guys been keeping up?
Yeah, we call each other almost every day. So yep.
Okay. All right. Is Mark back with us too? All right. Mark, are you back with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let's do this. First thing we'll do real quick is let's just read through the Hannah's prayer. We got 5 of you guys. We got 10 verses. So each of you guys take 2 verses, and we'll just go right through the passage. I want you to read the Hebrew text and try to read through it in a, we want to kind of work on our pace reading through it. And I realize everybody's at different stages, and that's fine. But read the Hebrew text and then give me your English translation. And then if anybody has a question about the translation or a different translation they want to give there, quickly we'll do that. And then I want to move it into where you guys can then, after having read through it, then begin to discuss that as you guys want to progress through it. This is going to be totally up to you guys. I want you guys to take the lead on this discussion. I got pastors in the group. I've got guys who like to teach. So that's what I want to see you guys do here. Okay. All right. So let's just start off. Whoever wants to start off, 2 verses apiece. Go ahead and let's start reading this.
I should mention I'm having a little bit of vertigo this evening.
You okay?
I had to turn the light off here in the earlier part, so I had my camera off. But let me take a crack at the first couple.
Okay.
And I'll do that. But Vatitaflail Hana Vatomar Alats Levi by Yaha.
That's Yahweh. That's a tetragrammaton there.
But
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's right. That's why it's hard to pronounce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, it's not supposed to be pronounced. Sorry. But Adonai Ramah Karani Ba Adonai Rahavi Al Oyava Ki
That'd be Oivai.
Avai, excuse me. Ki Shamachti Yeshuatika.
Yeah. Beshua Techa. Yeah.
All right.
Good. All right. And one more line.
Ein Kadosh Ka Adonai Ki Ein Biletka
Yeah. Biltecha.
Beltecha
Yeah. Good.
Ve'ein Or Elohenu.
Yeah. Kelohenu. Good. All right. And your translations, verses 1 and 2.
Then Hannah prayed, saying, my heart rejoiced in Yahweh. My strength is lifted up in Yahweh. My mouth is enlarged against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like Yahweh, no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God.
Okay, is there anything specific translation-wise that somebody wants to add to that real quick? Okay, if not, let's have somebody go ahead and take verses 3 and 4.
I can go.
Go for it.
Okay. El Rabu.
Yeah, just tarbu. That's a silent schwa. Al tarbu.
Okay, Torbu. Tadaber, Tadaber, Taber,
Tadabaru.
Tidabaru, Gabaha,
Gavoha.
Gaboha,
Gavoha. Yeah,
Gaboha,
it's a holum there. Yeah, Gavoha.
Gaboha. Itzam, Atak.
Oh, that's Yetse.
Oh, it's hey, okay.
Yeah, sometimes those vowel points, I get it, they're small, and so.
You
All right,
say Atak. Mifikim. Ki el the Daud Adonai.
The oat. That's a holum valve.
Okay. The oat. Walu.
Wait a minute, you just skipped over the tetragrammaton there. After deot.
Deot Adonai.
Yep.
Yeah. Walu.
Again, that's a holum there, so below.
Okay. Walu. Walu.
Low.
Okay. Low. Yeah, I always try to. It's like one dot inside and one dot up.
Yeah.
Low. Okay. Naskanu. Load.
There you go.
Load.
There you go. Now, you keep wanting to do that. You're right, but you got it that time. Good. All right. And next verse.
Kasset, Gabarim, Hatim,
Mhm.
Wanakasalaim,
Yeah. Benik Shalim.
Wanakasalaim, Salim. Okay. Azaru, Hayil.
Yeah. Chayil. Right. The emphasis on the first syllable there. So chayil. Yep. All right. Go ahead and give me your translation.
Do not make large, say exalted, go out arrogantly go out arrogant in from your mouth, because Yahweh is God of wisdom, and to him waited all of deeds.
Okay. And verse 4.
The bow of warriors are shattered, but the one who stumbled be girded with strength.
Okay. Does anybody have anything translation-wise they want to add to that, if they have anything different there? I noticed you translated, let me go back, deot, I think you did wisdom as opposed to knowledge. Typically, deot is knowledge there.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody rendered that as knowledge as opposed to wisdom there.
I rendered it as knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think it essentially changes the idea that you did that, but all right. Any other notes or on the translation? Okay. Let's keep moving on the reading and translation then. All right. Who's next? Verses 5 and 6.
I can try those.
Go for it.
5 and 6. Sheveim,
That's a
Balechem.
sheen, not a sheen. That's the dot over the left-hand serif.
Yeah. So Sheveim, Balechem, Niskaru, Urevim, Chadelu, Ad Akara, Yalda, Shiva, Rabat, Banim, Umlala, Adonai, Memit, Chaye, Morid, Shaol, Vaya'al.
All right, that's it right there. Good. Your translation now.
5 and 6. The ones satisfied with bread hire themselves out, but the hungry cease. While the barren has borne 7, but the one with many sons withers. The Lord kills and keeps alive, bringing down to Sheol and bringing up.
We got some interesting language in this poem here. All right, anybody have anything they want to add to that translation-wise? Not adding to the Word of God, of course, but anything, comments you have, translation. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and read verses 7 and 8 then.
I'll take those.
Okay.
Verse 7, Adonai Marish Umaashir Mashafil Af Maruf Omaim. Me verse 8, Mikim Me Afar Thou Me Ashfot Yarim Avion Lahoshiv Imnadi Nadivim Wakisi Kavod Yanihalam Kila Adonai Masuke Aras Wayashit Alehem Table.
Okay. Go ahead and translate.
Verse 7 reads, Yahweh takes possession of others' things and makes rich, humiliates and exalts. Placing in verse 8, placing the poor from the dust, from ashes, he will exalt the poor against those dwelling with the noble and the throne. He will cause them to inherit a seat of honor, since by Yahweh is the pillars of the land, and he put the world upon them.
What was that second to last phrase you did? The first one in verse 8. Sorry, the second to last phrase.
He will cause them to inherit a seat of honor.
The one after that.
Since by Yahweh is the pillars of the land, and he put the world upon them.
All right. Anybody have anything different on the translation here? Or anything I want to note there?
I did not render it instrumentally, I guess, like that. I just said the columns of the earth are Yahweh's, just as a possessive.
Yeah, I thought that the Lamed preposition here was indicating agency, so that was the interpretation of the preposition there. But I
Sure.
can understand why you might have taken that. It seemed that in the context of that whole stanza, that he's trying to make the point that because he established the earth, that gave the reason for how he could exalt the poor from their destituteness, and thus a declaration of agency made more sense, is part of my rationale.
Yeah,
for that.
you can do it that way. A Lamed, though, oftentimes is to or toward, but it's the idea of belonging to.
Yeah.
So is how it's often used as well. And so you'll see some translations that'll simply render that, right? For, right, it belongs to the Lord, right?
Right.
The idea. So that's certainly a viable route to go. I know translations will render it that way also. So how did you say you did it, Josh?
The columns of the earth are Yahweh's, is what I said.
Yeah, so that's what you're doing
Or
with the
for,
long,
yeah.
they're belonging to, right? That with the R. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. Anybody have anything else? Okay. And verses 9 and 10, I believe that leaves you, is that you, Don?
Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Ragle, Consido,
Chasidav.
Hasida. That's okay. Yishmor. Urasha Im. Beko Shak.
Choshech.
Bahoshek.
Yeah. Good.
Yedamu.
Mhm.
Kilo. Bekoa. No, Vekoa. That's not correct, is it?
Yeah.
Vekoa.
Koch. Good.
All right. Yigber. Ish. Are we saying Adonai?
I don't know. Yeah.
Adonai? My mind's slipping here. All right. Yek. Yeka. Yeaka. Yeak.
Yechatu.
Yeak. Yeak2. Yeaka2. Yeaka2. Marivo. Alo.
Yeah. Alav.
Alav. Mashamayim. Your aim. Adonai. Yadin. Upsay. Rates. Arets.
Yeah. Aretz. Yeah. Emphasis on the
Aretz.
first syllable. You see the Atnach there under the Aleph.
Mm-hmm. Vayatin oats. Lama ko. Vayarm. No, Vayarame. Vayarame. Is that right?
Yeah.
Karetz. Karen.
Karen.
That's Karen.
You know, people talk about don't be a Karen, but this is Karen.
Karen.
Sorry. Okay.
Mashiko.
Mashiko. Good. All right. Very good. Let's go ahead and translate verses 9 and 10.
The feet of his loyal one he shall guard, but the wicked ones in darkness they shall perish. For not by strength shall a man prevail. Verse 10, the Lord shall shatter the one opposing him. Against him in heaven he shall make thunder. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth. He shall give strength to his king, and he shall exalt the horn of his anointed one.
All right. Good. Okay. Anyone have anything they want to share translation wise on that?
I have a question. I'm not sure I've asked you this yet, Dr. Lyon. How would you suggest we translate chesed?
Oh, that's a great question. It's English is very difficult to capture that, quite frankly. So one of the things that it does overall, right? It's just, loving kindness. You'll see it translated that way as kindness or loving kindness, something along that line, and that's fine in one sense. But it's really, I think, even more than that. This is his covenant faithfulness is a lot of what Chesed envelops there. So again, it has a semantic range like any term does. So it's going to depend on the occurrence here. And again, here we see Chesed. What verse was that?
It's in verse 9. Chasidav.
Yeah. So you can say in this case here, it's interesting there. How did you translate that again? Did you say like faithful ones or something? Is that what you translated that as, Don? You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I translated it the feet of his loyal one.
Yeah, loyal ones. And that's really not a bad translation there for that, quite frankly. That is in the context of covenant faithfulness, loyalty there. That's I think that works there, what you did. How did the rest of you guys translate that there?
I translated it faithful here, but I always struggle with that with that word.
Yeah, but there is this idea of his kindness, his loving kindness, but it's coupled with, and it's not really detached from so much his covenant faithfulness there, and so that he gives us it's his kindness, I mean that he stays loyal to the covenant that he made, regardless of what they do, if you will, and so on. He is faithful, and extends his kindness, his grace to his people. Um, so it's almost like you have to sit there and talk about the word and talk about who God is and his relationship with his people when you talk about this term. That's why we have commentaries, and that's why we get up there and preach sermons and explain these words to people instead. And so sometimes you have to, you're always stuck with a series of compromises when you're translating because you have to choose a word and go with it, kind of thing. Unless you want to pick a word slash this, it makes for bad English. But if you want to kind of put multiple ideas there together, with a little slash, if you will. So
it does seem like you could, though, with that one, get exactly the opposite of what is intended. If you say faithful ones, Mark, which is what I did at first, you have a reciprocity. So the covenant relationship is viewed as reciprocal. I'm doing what God says to do. But couldn't the idea also be the recipient of God's faithfulness? And that isn't exactly communicated by faithful in English. Does that make sense?
yeah, those who are recipients of it is what you're saying.
That just came to mind. I mean, I struggle with the term also because I'm not in this context. It seems like it is talking about the reciprocal part of the covenant relationship.
And I mean, that's certainly a good point. I think part of the reason I translated it that way is because it looks to me like in the context of the verse is being contrasted with the wicked. So I'm trying to figure out how to translate it in a way that brings that out. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I asked. It's tricky. I've actually got a book called Untranslatable, and the whole book is about the word Hesed. So that's why I asked.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if it makes a difference, but I did capitalize loyal and one. I looked at this, the feet of his loyal one as being a messianic. In other words, and the feet of this loyal one, this Messiah one, he shall guard. And then, of course, the rest of that would just be in contrast to that. I don't know if that made sense, but
No, no, it does. Yeah, singular does change it slightly, I think.
All right, I'll tell you what, Mark, why don't you start us off here from there? You can start off the beginning of this prayer, or whatever issues you want to address first. Go for it.
All right. Well, I guess if we want to start at the beginning, one thing I found interesting, just looking at the poetic structure of this, is in verse 1. It looks like you've got these two bicola with a sort of a chiastic structure, with the cola about Hannah's horn being exalted in the middle. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth opens wide against my enemy. And then that's framed with her rejoicing in God or in his salvation. And it's interesting that that idea of the exaltation of the horn is highlighted there, since that comes back again at the end in kind of an inclusio there, with the ideal of exalting the horn of the anointed one, or the Messiah. So it seems like that's a very significant theme of the prayer then, because it's highlighted at the beginning and then brought back there at the end. I just thought that was interesting. And then the whole idea of the way that the image of the horn plays out later with respect to the king and the anointing of the kings with the horn. And that's something that I want to continue to explore further. But I thought that was one thing that was interesting. Another thing in my research, this is more of a general comment that I found about this, is that first of all, it's described as a prayer here, but everything's declaratory. She is proclaiming God's character, and then on that basis, it seems like making predictions about his future faithfulness to his people at the end, how God will behave because of who he is. But one of the comments that I saw was with respect to kingship, that God is being portrayed here. God himself is being portrayed here as the righteous king, the one who rules righteously, and the descriptions here of his behavior, particularly with respect to raising up the poor, raising up the needy, protecting the faithful but judging the wicked, are all characteristics of righteousness, of a righteous ruler. And so I thought that was interesting, because then as we progress through the theme of kingship in Samuel and then into Kings, the whole idea is, who is the one who will rule righteously as God does? And so, you see David even talking about that. So there's all of these parallels between Hannah's song then and David's last words. And David talks about the one who will rule in righteousness, and then his house is not so with God. Verse 3 of 2 Samuel 23. When one rules justly, tzaddik, over men, ruling in the fear of God. So I just thought that was an interesting idea, that Hannah's presenting God here as the one who rules righteously, and that the righteous king will demonstrate the same character of God that she's describing here in her prayer. I don't know if anybody came across that idea, but I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, good observation, just structurally as well, that kind of mini chiasm there in verse 1 there, the focus there, kind of sandwiched in there, the horn being exalted in the Lord, and of course the inclusio around the song as a whole, there with the exaltation there, the king, the anointed one there, the exaltation of the horn of his anointed one, the Messiah, his Mashiach there. In verse 10. So certainly the case there. Good. Anybody want to respond or pick up where Mark has been discussing here?
I just wanted to comment that there was, as far as what this is, I did stick with calling it a prayer, because that is the range of meaning of the verb at the beginning. I can't read the small print. Let me make it bigger. But the pele, it's a hifpale. The range of the hifpale stem of that verb is much more narrower than the peel, and it's almost always in this stem a reference to praying. And so, contrary to Michael Brown or not Michael Brown, but this is it from the Moody Handbook. Contrary to James Coakley, I didn't see reason to call it a song. We can call it a prayer, since we call it, a lot of the Psalms are prayers, and yet we call them psalms. We don't have to modify this text to call it something when it self-identifies itself as a prayer. It just didn't seem, a prayer is not in contradiction to poetry in the biblical literature.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I mean, a prayer, and by the way, oftentimes you have a prayer, and you just mentioned the Psalms. I'm glad you referenced that, because these prayers are often sung. They're put to lyric.
Right.
And so oftentimes they're really synonymous, quite frankly, a lot of times, right? That is, these prayers are often sung. And so that idea is still the same. So, but yeah, I would translate it as a prayer, because that's typically how that's rendered.
Yeah.
Although it may function as the same way, a prayer, a song, poetry. I mean, it's all those things are synonymous in how they're presented in this sense, as far as the effect there. But yeah, I would still prefer translating it as prayer here, certainly.
I didn't translate it any differently, because I kind of struggle with the nature of the hispale actually just being an intensive reflexive. Like, what exactly, like what is going on? I mean, I know there's some that just occur in the hispale, and it doesn't really.
Yeah, palal often occurs in the hip pile, by the way. So,
okay.
So
it's just kind of what it is.
The Hebrew canon, when it talks about them praying, it uses the hip pile quite often. So that's a pretty common occurrence. It's kind of like, with devar, why does it often occur in the PL? And it's rendered just like a cow anyway.
It's because it does.
But it just shows up in the PL. It's just for, there's just exceptions. There's ways that certain words tend to show up. So sometimes you don't want to make too much of it and try to make more of what's actually there, right? So in this case, that's how
I didn't, but I was wondering if I should. That's all.
No. I think you're correct, and that's how it's typically rendered.
Yeah, and I came across, as I was looking at that, because I was, I kind of spent some time on that too, because I found that interesting, and I noticed that BDB mentioned that sometimes that hitpile is used to refer to poetical or liturgical prayer, which we have here, and it gives, of course, Hannah's prayer as an example, but also the prayer of Jonah in Jonah chapter 2, which is also in poetic form and uses the same verb. So I thought that was kind of interesting, an interesting idea that a poetic prayer maybe could be introduced by, because I was looking at the primary meanings of the hitpile of this verb, and it talked about the idea of intercession, and I thought, well, I'm not really sure that's present here. So, but maybe it is. I don't know. That's a curious verb.
Fire away, gentlemen, fire away. And by the way, there's actually quite a bit of shared vocabulary, themes, motifs, ideas between Hannah's prayer and Jonah's prayer as well. And so, death, life, raising up, all of those terms used in reference to Jonah's experience there. and the great fish. They're in the depths of the sea and in the great fish. So there's actually quite a bit there. And not only that, with some of the Psalms, 86 through 89 in particular, there with Jonah's prayer. But so there's going to be a lot of this language that you start to see in context of certain ideas. But I don't want to get too much into that at the moment. But there is actually quite a bit of these ideas that others have noted there. And when you start seeing these poetic, seams in these texts, because Jonah's a narrative, right? And you've got that poetic seam, if you will, that prayer which stands out in the book of Jonah. And so immediately you take notice, just structurally, literarily, at the significance of the prayer there in the book, for example, as you do here in this narrative of Samuel and these bookends, essentially bookends, these prayers, these poetic seams in Samuel. So I'm glad you at least made an initial connection there, because there's actually quite a bit shared ideas, themes there in Jonah's prayer as well.
I also saw from the last word of verse 1 is rejoice in your salvation.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have a detailed analysis of this psalm or prayer, I would thought Hannah just talk about his defeat his what the other lady's name, Penina. Yeah. But she,
And don't be thinking about Panera, some panini bread or something when you say that. Don't act like it didn't cross your mind.
Well, the amount of consonants between the three names, Elkanah, Hannah, and Penina, makes it hard to say. Must have been difficult to live in that house. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it
if you
just
kind of messed up who you were trying to talk to, you can just kind of mumble your words together, to kind of like, yeah, and they'll answer.
Yeah, so it just, definitely is much beyond what she was facing in her own situation. So and we will see that clearly when it's end to anointed one. So it just some observation from verse 1.
Her trajectory, begins with these personal pronouns, but it is, remarkable, I think, the depth at which she felt assaulted simply by her barrenness. And I think that's something that we are obligated to communicate. And certainly the salvation, that trajectory is carried on throughout the poem. But I think she is directly talking about her personal deliverance from that verbal assault by her sister wife, if we want to use that term, whatever the other one, which is pretty profound.
TLC, Josh?
Response to, no, I don't know what it's supposed to be called. Other wife, her husband's other wife.
Oh, goodness.
But we have a weird situation, when dealing with polygamy anyway, in scripture. But the the narrow context in which she was able to exist with her enemies. The Psalms are full of, enemies that are stuck outside the city walls, enemies that are not in close proximity, and still David feels it deeply. But we have to communicate, the context, I think, of what she's talking about initially here.
Yeah, that's good. She's clearly addressing the immediate context and the conflict there, the enemies, which, by the way, I think I mentioned last week, Hannah's prayer also serves as a program for the rest of the book, right? With the exaltation of the lowly, the humble, the godly, the righteous, and the debasing of the proud, the exalted ones there, which you see play out. Of course, it begins here with Hannah being exalted and Penina, and she outdoes Penina and so on in this case as well. But she's clearly speaking beyond her days as well. She's speaking this prayer, prophesying this prayer concerning things well beyond her. This is the period of the judges, and she's talking about, at the least, if you want to reject the notion that this is talking about the Messiah, which I would argue it is, if you wanted to reject that, at the least, it's pointing to David. So she's still pointing forward to a time beyond her time. At the least, you've got to say that. But I would argue, based on David's words and the parallels there, that David would say no, and David actually confirms that she's talking beyond him to Messiah. So while I think it does point to him, it points ahead, but it's pointing ultimately to a scion of David, this descendant of David who is to come, and that seems to be confirmed. But she's clearly speaking, and it's addressing the events in her own time, but at the same time, this God, the same one who will raise up her horn, right, is the one who will raise up, the horn of the anointed, the Messiah. And so what is exhibited in God's faithfulness in her own life, right, is indicative of what he's going to do in the future. This is this faithful God that she is praying to and speaking of in this text. So good observation, Josh. They're certainly addressing the present and also what's going to unpack, if you will, unfold in the book. But then also, I do think you have to say at the least, she's clearly speaking well beyond her days. The context is the period of the judges. There is no monarchy yet. At the least, it's David. But I think the text confirms in the words of David that it is indeed speaking beyond him. But good. So certainly the immediate context there, but interestingly enough, in that context there of Hannah's own prayer, that she takes the reader beyond that time.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I wanted to comment on, is this theme of how God reverses fortune or lifts up and abases. That the way that's played out in the rest of Samuel, particularly with respect to David and Saul, because I mean, I think about like verse 8, where it talks about he lifts up the needy to cause him to dwell with nobles and give him the seat of honor as a possession. And I think of what David says about, how God took him from following the sheep and set him on the throne of Israel. But also the fact that Hannah's point here is that it's God that does this, right? Verse 9, not by means of strength will a man prevail. God is the one who raises up and puts down. And just how David sort of embodies that in his dealings with Saul. I'm not gonna kill Saul, even though God has delivered him into my hand. I'm not gonna raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. If God is going to raise me up, he'll be the one to do it. And so the fact that David kind of embodies the same reliance on God to exalt him at the proper time, and draws that theme out of this prayer, I think is pretty suggestive.
Yeah, just another intertextual thought here. I did mention a bit ago, I think earlier tonight, we've got the Davidic covenant established here. It's essential, at the heart of Samuel. They're in 2 Samuel 7. But really, the book of Isaiah actually unpacks it much more. We get much more detail concerning the Davidic covenant there in Isaiah than we do here in Samuel. What's interesting here with Hannah's programmatic statement there, for example, the exaltation and the debasing there. What's interesting in the book of Isaiah, what precedes the call narrative of Isaiah, in the opening 5 chapters in particular, you have repeatedly, the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and that the proud and arrogant, all those people will be brought low. And in fact, they're commanded to hide themselves in the dust of the earth. That's exactly where we'll see Uzziah, right? He's dead. He's in the dust of the ground and so on. And who does he see? Who does he see when Uzziah is dead in the dust of the ground? That exalted king, that arrogant king who was struck with leprosy. We'll get to that. But he sees Adonai sitting on the throne in the temple, high and exalted, lifted up. I mean, so I think there's a lot more as it's introducing things there as well. But these themes there of exaltation and debasing are things that we see not only here, but we see it elsewhere. And so you do see that preparing the reader in the opening chapters of Isaiah before you get to Isaiah 6, for example. And so it's interesting there because you don't see Uzziah's son named. It's Adonai he sees on the throne there. So anyways, that's another discussion we'll have another time. But these ideas pick up beyond the book of Samuel. And so very interesting as well. So good, Mark. Anything else you guys want to add to that? All right, very well. I think what we can do then, for time's sake, we've got almost an hour, just to kind of keep moving through here. Any other comments or observations you want to make on Hannah's prayer? We'll go ahead and do some reading in 2 Samuel 7. Questions or issues you see raised?
Sorry, just something like I think from verse 6 to even to the end. From the verse 6, God looks like he chose to do something to one group of people and other to another group of people with no clarification who are these people and why. But I would think starting verse 9, that is the what are these people? What are the people who was given life and the one who was killed? That is the chesed. That's, I think Mark mentioned, it is the wicked versus the faithful. And then that transfer to the verse 10, that is the anointed one, the king. So I see is even from even verse 6, given life and raised up from the shell, that is the anointed one, the king. It's like further clarification and further development from verse 6 to 10. Yeah.
That's an interesting observation, Yahweh. Also in Psalm 1 and 2, you got the interesting parallels between, in that case, it uses the term, the tzedakим, right, the righteous there, and it uses there again the rashaim in relationship, of course, to the Messiah, to the King, to the Anointed One, and to the Son of God. So those three terms used there in Psalm 2 in particular there, but you got the tzedakim and the rashaim there. So it's kind of synonymous with the tzedakim, and in this case, you use the root chesed, but again, the faithful, the loyal ones, the righteous ones, versus the wicked, right? And of course, in relationship to is dealing with them in their relationship to the King, to the Son of God, to the Messiah, there in Psalm 1 and 2. But in here, there might be something of that nature going on as well. That's an interesting thought there. Just because you see that comparison and contrast between the righteous and the wicked there very clearly in Psalm 1 and 2, but you do see that there is that going on here with these two groups of people here in Hannah's prayer. And right, the ones on the receiving end of the judgment, of the death, of the bad stuff, right, are the Rashaim in both cases, right? So. Right. Anybody want to respond to that or add anything? Or
I drew from verses 3 through 5 the themes of giving of life, childbearing, and like war as kind of leading up to the statement that Yahweh causes death and causes life. Because the song had just gone through those topics of those hungry going away looking with food and whatnot. I just thought that was maybe a summarization. I saw an explanation on that, I guess.
Yeah, I like that, Jacob. I thought, yeah, from looks like I saw that 6 to 10 is like one step further development. You know, they're connected somehow. And then 5 is kind of with Hannah's more personal or current situation with her barrenness.
Okay.
I'd have to say that I'm impressed with this woman. She is sophisticated. She is learned. She's able to communicate some superb ideas in and of themselves. And it causes me to think of where did she get this understanding? Is this something that was more prevalent in the society at that time? I mean, we read Judges, you read early chapters of Samuel, it seems like everyone's pardon the expression, an idiot. I mean, they just selfish, self-centered. Doesn't seem anybody that would even think this kind of thoughts. So,
well, it's
I
an
just
interesting
wonder.
thought. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, Don. So, for example, the book of Ruth is placed in the period of the Judges as well. And so you have these two paragons of righteousness, Boaz and Ruth, compared in contrast to that. Now, keep in mind, in the period of Judges, they're right. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? There was no king in Israel 4 times saying that anticipating a king. So that's an anticipation in that period. And there seems to be that indicated even in the book of Ruth, because the people, the elders there, seem to recognize what was happening in their midst as they proclaim there in chapter 4 of Ruth there concerning the work of God that they recognize in Ruth and Boaz. And they pray, may she be like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel. And of course, the author there then links that with the genealogies there to David and so on, this king. And so that's one of the major themes there, this lack of a seed and God working that through his people there, a seed that will come, of course, ultimately through David's line. So there does seem to be this very clear knowledge still of the Torah and God's promises, this coming one, and the recognition of these things when they see it happening in their midst. There, for example, in the book of Ruth, and that's in the period of the Judges there. So yes, while the nation at large is described that way, there are righteous men and women. So we have both Ruth and Boaz there, and the elders who are recognizing this and who are expressing, they're very aware of the scriptures there and what God is promising and recognize what's happening there. And so it may very well be there with Hannah as a righteous woman, that this is not, and of course, in relationship to the tabernacle, the priest there, giving her son there to be raised there in the temple there, the priest, that she likely would have, she was around that knowledge and likely had knowledge of this. And so that would be very, very likely in this case, considering the context in which she's given her son Samuel to be raised there by the priest. So I think that it's not that knowledge is gone. It's just, there are those, it's there. But again, the large portion of the nation is described a certain way, correct. But the knowledge of the Lord, the knowledge of his word is still there. So I just wanted to kind of bring that out with Ruth and the context here in Samuel in the period of the Judges as well.
By nature, you have to assume that she was exceptional also among her
Yeah.
peers. I think you're getting at that.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I walk around and I hear people tell me, you got to hear this pastor preach this message. And basically it's how to lose weight for Jesus and you should recycle. And that's what's out there, right? So, I mean, but you have exceptional individuals, in the church
Yeah.
that are more concerned about it. So I think, in other words, I'm sorry, I agree with you, Dr. Lyon. I know that was
no, I think you're
to
right.
your
And
point.
It's doing that with Hannah just as it was doing with Ruth and Boaz in contrast to the rest of the nation. Yeah.
I also noted just in the general patterns that Hannah brought out. It's interesting to me that over the course of human history, large swaths of it have been embroiled in essentially uniformitarian fatalism. Kind of the idea that what God has made you, you'll always be, and it'll always be like it's always been. and our best days are behind us. And Hannah's focus is always on God inspired sovereign transitions from might to weakness, from weakness to might, from wealth to poverty, from poverty to wealth. And I think that's an important picture there.
Yeah, it certainly speaks against such a notion there. And by the way, that's common from antiquity to modern times. That believers and people of different persuasions had that kind of notion. That's kind of my lot in life, you know. Yeah.
On that note, I would just, I mean, in the, let's say, Chinese wisdom or culture, they always have those type of sayings. But is this particularly talk about David or even Christ? Or is she just talk about the general wisdom? I take it more, if I look at, if I took verse 6 to 10 as one group, is further development is pointing to the final Messiah. So this is not a general human wisdom rather than specific situation.
I think in 6 to 10, it might be narrowing down. Yahweh, certainly the experience of being brought to humility and to nobility is there, right? But I mean, the what I was specifically talking about were the starting in verse 4, the bows of the mighty are shattered. Those are very general references. The feeble gird on strength. I mean, obviously, he's not talking about David when he says the barren gives birth to 7. We only have that foolishness in 2023, right? That somebody who calls himself a man can also have a period and have a baby. So it took us thousands of years to get that stupid. So I think there's generalities and specificity there.
Yeah, agree.
So, yeah.
Oh, the days we're living in. All right.
Now, did Hannah write this? Did Hannah write this thing down herself? Close to when she actually said it? Or is this something that Sam or someone else years later said? Let me write this down as I think you may have said it or meant it. In other words, we got this in print. We've got this in the canonical shape that it's in. Is that how Hannah actually spoke it? And was that written down, by Eli or by someone there? And then, or was it something that Samuel, when he got older and talking with his mom, then said, well, that's pretty good. Let's write this down. So that has some inspiration questions there. In other words, this poem, reflects ideas that are stated later in Samuel, like 2 Samuel 7, and actually over in chapter 22 and 23, and even beyond that. So is it something that a redactor said, Hannah said some things, she had a prayer, and let's go ahead and flesh this out for her. Let's go ahead and articulate this on her behalf. You see my question?
Yeah, not only that, Don, there are some who question whether or not Hannah prayed this at all, right? So because of the prophetic nature of this text, right? So different issues have been raised regarding this. So I would certainly disagree, and there's no textual basis other than, I think, a preconceived notion why somebody would suggest that, right? I think it's a particular uh, uh, position that someone would hold to that would drive them to make such a suggestion on that, because of the prophetic nature of it. All right, that's why they propose a second and a third Isaiah, for example, in the book of Isaiah, because of that very issue there. So we have to be honest about people's presuppositions, their particular views on things and how that can shape the way that they view a text and ask questions about the text. And so before you even get to your question, there are those who question whether she even prayed that prayer at all. Okay, because it's almost a after the fact kind of thing that was put in, if you will. And so that will then transition to your question then. Well, if she did pray it, when did she, did she record it and then somebody else put it in, the final editor or whatever? The text doesn't seem to give an indication of when exactly that took place, but it does seem to indicate in a straightforward historical narrative, that's the context, that's the framing of the prayer there, that it is recording things that actually transpired in history. And there's no suggestion in the text to think otherwise, is what I would say. Right. So in one sense, it doesn't matter whether it was Eli or whether it was Hannah or Samuel or someone a little later that gave it its final shape at whatever point. So whether it was orally handed down, here's Hannah's prayer, right? Or it was written down early on and then preserved, and then whenever it got in its final shape put in there. I don't know that we can know that with certainty, but I don't think the text gives us any indication to think anything other than this was something that she actually prayed, and that was handed down in some shape, form, or fashion, and part of the final canonical shape. So I don't know that we can answer exactly when or the form in which it got into its final shape. But I do think that the text seems to clearly indicate, with no suggestion contrary, that this is something that actually happened, that she actually prayed this prayer. Now, whether or not it's her whole prayer, right? It's the Sermon on the Mount, the entire sermon, or does it give us just what we need for the text? Is this all of Hannah's prayer, or does it give us just simply what we need for the purpose of the text? I mean, is it excerpted? We don't know. We can't say. Is that all? I mean, but the text includes everything we need to know. So I think there are a lot of questions that we could ask. When Jonah responds to the sailors, right, and responds who he is when they ask him the questions. Well, the text doesn't give us everything he said, because a verse or two later tells us, oh, by the way, they knew because he had shared with them another detail. Well, it didn't tell us that detail earlier. It tells us what we need to know. And so does it give us her whole prayer as it was exactly prayed? Does it leave out some things, an introduction to the prayer, a latter part, or is it only, giving us this particular part of the prayer that the author wants to use for the purpose of this text? I mean, I don't know, but she prayed it, and I believe that that's what Hannah prayed. I have no reason, based on the text, the prayer being framed in the historical narrative the way that it is, that it happened any other way. Now, as far as some of the details, the text, I would argue, simply doesn't supply that for us. And that's okay. So I don't know if it was written down by Hannah. She prayed the prayer and was like, oh, that's good. I need to post that on Facebook, like people like to do today, right? I got to post my quiet time for everyone to see. Okay, I'm just messing. Okay.
Yeah,
But
I'm
that's
good
a
with
good
that.
question, Don. But I think it goes back to, ultimately, we don't have to, I don't know
Well,
how
I
it
think
got.
the question arises. Yeah, I think the question arises because we're talking so much about the canonical shape. The
Yeah.
idea that there were redactors that came back and organized the material so that it it holds together. It's thematic. And so therefore, because we're talking about that, that does raise the question as to how much someone monkeyed with the text. And so that's why I brought it up there.
Yeah.
I could see Hannah coming every year when she came to visit Samuel, praying again and praying similar prayers all along, year after year. And maybe Samuel then, and these prayers began to be, almost the same prayer year in and year out. And so I can see where Samuel may have at some point in time said, Mom, this is a wonderful testimony, to the Lord and to even maybe what the future holds and the way things are now. And he may have written it down, though we don't know that. That's my pastoral imagination running wild. But because I do think that the question is significant. because if we can account for Hannah's prayer apart from Hannah, then that causes all kinds of problems throughout the text. So either we have to say God has to figure this out for us and has to know these things, which ultimately we have to trust his word that way. But when we're making these canonical connections, we're showing all of the ways in which someone, we're thinking on the human side, orchestrated or arranged, the text so that it reads the way it does, then I think that's a legitimate question then as to, how does this all come together? So that's some thoughts I'm thinking. I don't necessarily have to have an answer for
Yeah,
that.
you can ask the same question about just about every book of the Bible, right? Because the events narrated in books, especially his, narrative text, generally happen over the course of decades, right? Same thing with the book of Samuel. The book of Samuel, from the period of the judges all the way up into the monarchy. So this covers a pretty significant amount of time, right? So it's not a single author, clearly, right? So you've got somebody at some point, you have things being recorded, passed down orally, written records, whatever. And at some point it's put in. Same thing with the Torah. You've got Moses wasn't there at creation. He wasn't there at the flood. He wasn't there at the Tower of Babel. He wasn't there when Abraham was called, or Abram at the time was called, and so on. He was there when he was there. So you could say the same thing about the book of Kings. You could say the same thing. All of these books, you've got events that transpire over the course of decades, across the span of multiple lifetimes of people and so on, generations. And so you had the same scenario here. And I don't have issue with that, right? So we've got text, we've got written records, we've got oral tradition, whatever it is. But these are things, they're presented by whoever the author is in the final shape in which it's given. They are presented as, matter of fact, this is what happened in historical narrative. So when we have historical narrative, it's presented that we're to take it as history. That we're to take it as this is what transpired. So I have no reason to think from the biblical text, from the book of Samuel, to think anything other than that the author intended for the reader to understand that Hannah actually prayed this prayer. Now, is this the whole of her prayer? We don't know because the text doesn't specify that for us, but that she prayed a prayer, and this was at least part of that prayer. So the problem comes in when people want to then argue that, well, Hannah didn't pray this prayer, right? That this has been concocted for a theological purpose or whatever, and so they've got reasons why they suggest that potential there. And I would suggest that the reason for raising the possibility that Hannah did not pray that prayer, it is not for textual reasons, but rather for reasons outside the text. That is, they're bringing certain ideas to the text, and that is what's driving that. So again, I don't think there's anything within the text to alarm the reader, to suggest to the reader anything other than that the text is recording for us what happened. And in fact, the text can do those things in poetic fashion, and it does so in cases. That doesn't make that any less historical either. For example, Judges 5, Exodus 15, and so on. But anyways, I think it's a good question there. I think the challenge, so I don't have any concerns personally, and I don't think you guys do either. I think you're just raising a legitimate question, though. So just to think through, because it doesn't just apply to the book of Samuel. What you asked applies really to most of the books of the Bible there.
A lot of people object, just on the basis of their perception of reasonability. Like, well, it's just not reasonable. Nobody could remember that much material just hearing it once. They may admit that Eli is there potentially, right? But people remember who have trained their minds to do that have remarkable ability to recall large swaths of information even upon hearing it once. In other words, it didn't necessarily have to be written down, but the repetition of the theological themes within the covenant community would make it fairly reasonable that somebody might remember. As you point out, it may not be every last detail, but it's going to be the central trajectory and progression of the word. I just try to remind people that your standards of reasonability have shifted in your Google environment where you carry vast quantities of encyclopedic knowledge on your belt every day or in your pocket. So reasonability, I just don't let people argue reasonability when that's thousands of years before they existed themselves. But I mean,
Yeah, that reminds me, as you're talking there, I was thinking about in the case of Jeremiah and the scribe Baruch there and the destruction of the first copy, and then all of a sudden we get another copy of it. Well, how do we explain that, right? It happened, right? And so God is able to communicate what he wants effectively through human agents.
Right. And certainly we shouldn't discount the work of the Spirit, in recalling that information as well. It is a supernatural process.
Yeah, and by the way, we have examples as we look at Chronicles and other texts. Isaiah was a historian, by the way. And you see quite a bit of intertextual and comments to that effect in Isaiah and Chronicles, for example. So I think clearly we have numerous instances in the biblical text where they give references to sources, where they give references to historical records, those kind of things that were at the disposal of the prophets and so on. So that's not uncommon. So these guys weren't idiots. I mean, in fact, I would argue they were probably more brilliant than we are. And so they had records. In fact, when you think about the ancients, when you think about scholars from the past, they could actually cite scripture way better than we can. They weren't relying on the technology that we are. When I read a lot of the ancient writings and look at the breadth and the depth of their knowledge, it is remarkable when you read these guys. I look at them, I'm just like, man, these guys are studs. That's what I walk away thinking. So far from, oh man, how could they do that? That's from our narrow perspective, in our experience, because in our day, it's more difficult because we're so dependent on other things. They weren't. They didn't have Bible Works and Logos software and all that kind of stuff. Man, they just read these scrolls. They just knew it. They just memorized it. They just meditated upon it. Man, this is what they thought about. This is what they talked about. This is what they lived. Man, they breathed this. Man, they just knew this stuff. And we have great examples of that from antiquity, from the Second Temple period and beyond, of scholars, of theologians, of people who did that kind of stuff. So I don't see it as any surprise of the capabilities and furthermore, the superintendence of the Holy Spirit and so on. This is God's revelation ultimately, right? So for this, but it is interesting though, but the biblical text does give us instances of sources, historical sources, all the records and so on as well. So they had all that at their disposals there, and they utilized that stuff. Based on the biblical text, there are instances where we see they utilize this stuff. And they were aware of other texts, non-biblical text, right? They were aware of the book of Enoch, for example, and other texts. And so these guys were aware. They were sharp. I mean, God used them, and so I think it's the more you look into it, the more you will marvel at the work of God in revealing Himself and doing it through these human agents. And as you look at the historical evidence there for the writing and canonization process, all of those things, I think you come away more impressed than you do with what was it you were saying, Josh? The challenge. What was the word you gave a second ago? The reasonability.
Yeah, reasonability.
I find
it's just subjective.
More, yeah. For me, that just vanishes away. Quite frankly, the more you actually look into it. So,
well, not only did they not need Google, they didn't need chapters or verses.
Yeah, they did.
Or books, like as we talked about in the Torah, they would be able to navigate that huge scroll without a single. I mean, they were amazing, and so we shouldn't cease to be amazed by it. Yeah.
Hey, they would just open up the a Psalter scroll and say, "Hey, flip over to Eli Eli lama sabachthani." Just flip over there. You know what that is? That's Psalm 22, right? They just knew the beginning of these psalms and these sections, and I mean, they know this. When Jesus states that from the cross, they knew what He was saying. But yeah, that's a great question, Don. And I think that's all. I'm glad you brought that up because, quite frankly, that's a kind of question that the people in the pews have. And those are important questions as they are trying to understand the nature of God's word. Right? All right, other thoughts, comments on that? All right, I appreciate that. We've had a nice, diverse discussion here, so that's good. Let's do this. We've got a little over 20 minutes here. Let's flip over to 2 Samuel 7, and let's at least allow you guys at this point pick up some discussion there, some observations on the text of 2 Samuel 7. Let's look in particular. Let's try to narrow up. I mean, the assignment was 2 Samuel 7. Where did I have you guys begin?
Verse 1.
And through 17?
Yep, that's right.
So really, yeah, I mean, well, you can go anywhere there, but in particular, as you get into looking at verses 9 through 16, in that range, any discussion that you guys, just looking at the text there, any issues you see or interesting observations, just go ahead and take it from here. So really anywhere in 2 Samuel 7, but in particular, verses 9 through 16.
I do have one which I struggled, with the seed. I think with verse 14 particularly, in his go astray, I will disappoint him in rod of man with the blow of son of man. So this is, if this is my struggle was, if this is a seed talks about Solomon, this would make sense. But if this talks about Jesus, it will be harder to understand. I read this version, which commentary, some commentary, New American Commentary, says this is a messianic, even from he used Hebrew 5:8-9. The go astray or in iniquity. He is a point like Jesus' prayer to God to remove the cup. So it is his obedience through the suffering that.
Who said that?
This is Burgeon, B-E-R. What is Robert Burgeon? B-E-R-J-E-N. So it just I personally have a question on that one also, because I see his kingdom will last forever. So this cannot be Solomon. That's what I saw. So this has to be the Messiah. But if it is Messiah, and then how this can be solved? How God disciplined Son of God. So with the rod of man and with the stripe of man, I can see it's beating Jesus, but it's in his iniquity. That is my question part.
Yep, that's a great question there. So I'm gonna let you guys respond there.
Yahweh, I took in that clause, in the syntax of the sentence, it's a relative clause introduced with Asher, and the Hifil infinitive construct for ha'oloto.
Which verse you in? Jacob,
Verse
what verse?
14. Verse 14 is what we're discussing, as Yahweh said. That's affixed to the be preposition, which can have a temporal meaning. And so I translate it as when he sins. And so it doesn't say he will sin, but when he sins, he will be reproved. So the promise indicates that if it's equally applicable to any Davidic descendant. But it's true, the final Messianic Davidic king will not sin, as we know. So I didn't have that problem because I seemed to understand it, I think correctly, that it's a kind of a temporal condition of saying when he sins without saying that he will sin.
Yeah, I think that's a good with the bait preposition there. I would agree with you on that. And you had it as if he sins as opposed to when, Yahweh. Is that how you did that?
Well, I'll be father to him
If he
until
commits iniquity.
in his iniquity,
Yeah.
I will discipline him.
Yeah, and I would agree with Jacob on that. You got the temporal construction there with the bait preposition there, so it's probably likely when. And I'm wondering too if perhaps interpreters, others have struggled with that, if that's what's led them to translate it as if as opposed to when, right? But also, I mean, I think Jacob's bringing up a point there. It doesn't. Oftentimes, right, you're still dealing with the promise is you got to get to Messiah from David to Messiah. So you got to have descendants. You got to have, Solomon and so on and all these people to get to Jesus, right? So it's clearly, as the rest of the book states, and as Isaiah picks up in full force on the Davidic covenant here, and clearly talking about the Messiah, the Son of God, on the throne of David. That's very clear. So we know that that's intertextually, I would argue intertextually within Samuel, but Isaiah clearly picking up on that in full force. So we know that this is certainly speaking of Messiah, but is it not also in this case? What I'm not talking about here is dual fulfillment kind of thing here, but you are talking about the context here, because David wanted to build a house, and God's telling him, "No, you did good in that you want to, but you're not going to. Your son's going to build it." So in the context here, he is talking about not only he is talking about Solomon, but he's going beyond that clearly as well, as verse 16 states. So verse 16 removes beyond a shadow of a doubt that, okay, yes, while God's addressing in the present, you're not going to do it. Your son's going to build this house. He says, I'm going to do you one better anyway. I'm going to build you a house. But it's verse 16, right? This is eternal. Right? Your house, your kingdom shall be established forever. Well, how's that going to happen? Right? And so it's moving, the text does move it beyond there, right? Certainly there. And so I think what Jacob's saying removes some of that tension there that you had, Yahweh.
Yep, that's good. I also remember now, I think we read some books talk about fulfillment of the prophet. It's like there's several categories of it's a type or final, and yeah, I forgot the details. So is it possible that both Solomon and Messiah, or it can only be one? I think that's I think it only can be when he talks about the kingdom will be forever. That cannot be Solomon's kingdom.
Correct.
Well, the way that they viewed that, though, was it's being established in perpetuity from that point in time. And so it has to be distributive in application,
yeah,
and conditional. And I think that's what Jacob is saying, is that it's distributive in the sense that everyone gets treated the same based on the condition of sin. And all sin would be recompensed, I guess you would say, would be disciplined, right? But the mechanics of perpetuity require the generations, right? Yahweh, right? He's not just talking about when Messiah comes, it's in perpetuity from then, but the prophecy is in perpetuity from actually David.
Yep.
And it had been removed from Saul. So, I mean, there's all sorts of conditions that had to be fulfilled in order for perpetuity to be established from that generation. And so that
Yeah.
prophecy has to be distributive.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was well said there. So it's not a dual thing. Is this dealing with Solomon and Jesus kind of thing and Messiah? It's a continuous, right? From David to Solomon and their descendants, and ultimately this eternal kingdom, yes, is going to go beyond them.
The perpetuity was established temporarily at that point.
Correct.
So, yeah, so that's a necessary condition.
So it would be correct to say that he's dealing with Solomon as dynastically. In other words, I shall be to him. He's talking about in the dynasty as a whole, the Davidic descendants, including the Messiah. In other words, there's not a change once the Messiah comes as to whether the Lord will reprove, if he goes astray. The thing is, the Messiah is not going to go astray. He's not going to sin.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to raise another point that's kind of framing this in the verses prior to this, immediately prior to this. When you go back to verse 10, for example, and 11, moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them. By the way, that's language that goes back to Eden language when he plants the garden there and he's planting his people in this land. This is kind of this eschatological type language that you see in the canon. I'm going to plant them that they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more. Well, that's a future. This is not something they've experienced. Okay, this is a future thing here because they are going to be moved from the land after David. So this is beyond that to a time where they're not going to be. He's going to plant them again, invoking that Eden imagery, and they're not going to be moved anymore. And then it goes on from there and says, nor shall the sons of wickedness oppress them anymore, as previously. So pointing back to the period of the judges. So verse 11, since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people, so pointing back there, the book prior to Samuel, and have caused you to rest from all your enemies, right? And so you've got that language there as well, which you see back in the Torah as well, related to Eden and God's desire to cause his people to rest in the land and so on. But this is a future time in which they're not going to move anymore, and this time of rest and so on as well. And then he goes on, also the Lord tells you that he will make you a house. You wanted to build me a house, but the Lord says, I'm going to build you a house. And so that term there, right, the house of David, the house can refer to a physical house, but that's not what God's talking about here. And the context is very clear. And what follows in these verses that we're actually started off discussing here, that he's not talking about a physical house as David wanted to build for him, but rather a dynasty. Right? So we talk about the house of David as the dynasty of David. And so beginning, of course, with him and his son Solomon and those who come after. And so that's what you guys are talking about. But I just wanted to point out the verses immediately preceding that give us further context there as to moving that as a future work of God that is beginning now. And it is sure, right? You can bank on it. It is a surety. It will happen. And it begins with David and his son, and then moves forward from there. And of course, ultimately will be an eternal. So you can count on it. It's not going to be broken from you, your son, till Messiah comes, right? When Yahweh accomplishes what he promises David.
Yeah, picking up on this discussion, there was a bit of intertextuality that I think is used here to signal this tension that we're talking about, which is this key verb that's used in this passage in terms of God's promise to David, which is havan, the establish. It's used over and over again here. Verse 12, I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verse 16, your throne shall be established forever. He uses that over and over again. And I just thought it was interesting that when we get into Kings, we're thinking we see that fulfilled at the end of like 1 Kings chapter 2, where it says the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So it's like, oh, that's the fulfillment of the promise. But then in the very next verse, it says Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt. And so there's this tension, like, wait a minute, can this king who is not living in obedience, he's going astray from the commandments of the covenant. Can this kingdom be established in his hand if he is disobedient, if he's committing this iniquity? And then you see that play out throughout Kings, in this descent of the kings into disobedience. So I just think that's really interesting that this key promise, this key verb here, that God will establish the kingdom, is used then to signal this tension in Kings of it's fulfilled, the kingdom's established. Wait a minute, Solomon has a problem. It's fascinating the way that, to me anyway.
But then, Mark, that's a great point there, because at the end of Kings, I don't know if you recall earlier, I noted there in 2 Kings 25, the end of Kings, you had this Davidic king there in exile. What has become of the house of David, right? And Yahweh raises up who? Jehoiakim, which means, and that's the root word, kun, to establish. Jehoiakim, Yahweh establishes. That's how the book of Kings ends. And then it picks up in Isaiah with none other than Jerusalem and the establishment of the Davidic dynasty. And of course, it's pointing directly to the Messiah at that point. So that's an interesting tension there, but it is established because Yahweh has promised and deemed it so, regardless of what they do. And this is part of the unconditional nature of the Davidic covenant, right? And the establishment of that, right? There is a conditional aspect and blessings and so on, because that's still part of the Mosaic covenant in which they are operating there. They're in the land, right? And so you've got that conditional aspect there, but the Davidic covenant is an extension, kind of a funneling from the Abrahamic covenant there. It's what God has promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is now going to be established through the house of David. And so that is a done deal. And that's essentially what David says in 2 Samuel 23.
Right.
He says, yeah, it's not so my house, but
right, the confidence that God will provide
in all things.
This righteous king. Yeah.
And so, because he talks about, in fact, in 2 Samuel, David in his speech there, he references the eternal covenant. So he addresses that. I'm kind of curious. Yeah, so he mentions there in verse 5, right? He says literally, not so my house. He describes the righteous rule of the king. He says, not so my house. I'm not the one you're looking for, guys. I know you had your hopes there, but I'm not the one. Clearly, his house was in disarray, right? So he had his faults, but he was a man after God's own heart, but he had his faults, no doubt. He said, not so my house with God, right? Yet he has made with me, he goes back to 2 Samuel 7, a what? An everlasting covenant, right? Ordered in all things and secure. For this, it's that. For this is all my salvation and all my desire, right? Will he not make it increase there? So again, you see the further commentary within the book of Samuel as David gives us further information. So the book, the author of the text has given us more information on how to understand what's, a further unpacking of the Davidic covenant here in 2 Samuel 7. And then in the Kings, which follows, gives further, a further fleshing out of it, quite literally and literarily, in the book of Kings. And then Isaiah, man, Isaiah is just powerful, just when you get to that and the unpacking of the Davidic covenant once we get there. Yeah, a good observation, Mark. And I think there at the end of Kings with Yahweh raising up Jehoiakim there, that is not by accident. And there's a reason why the author wants to make that point there at the end. Yeah, that's good. All right, we've got just a few minutes here. Any other observations in 2 Samuel 7? And so in verse 16, talk about this is an everlasting, and of course in 2 Samuel 23, there David refers back to this everlasting covenant. That, of course, by nature is it's unbreakable. I mean, it's everlasting. This is something that Yahweh will accomplish. So I think we have that hope. And by the way, that's also partly what helps the reader work through that tension in the book of Kings, Mark. Right? Canonically speaking, you're already prepared, if you will, to read the book of Kings and to see the house of David fall, if you will, and go into exile. Well, wait a minute, God has said this is what it is. What's going on here? And then you get that statement there at the end that Yahweh's raised up, who Yahweh establishes, that's his name. And then you're ready for the book of Isaiah. And so while it is this what has happened here, right? I think Samuel prepares you very well. You can't read Kings in a vacuum by itself. You read it in conjunction with Samuel. Same thing, Kings in the book of Isaiah. Very clearly the links between those books. And so you see this seamless thread there, the promises of God, the covenant with David, there in Samuel, right into Kings and into Isaiah, really across all three of those books. All right, any final comments, observations, or questions on with 2 Samuel 7? And I realize much more can be said, but any final thoughts or observations here?
I just noted that in verse 15, that permanence is not necessarily an intrinsic part of the definition of Hesed, because it's not going to be turned away from David, but it was turned away from Saul. So anyway, I've heard people overstate the definition there. Just as an observation.
Now say that one more time.
I was just saying that it's not that permanence is not an intrinsic or absolute part of the definition of Hesed, because it remains with David, but he did turn it away from Saul. And so it's still subject to contextual definition, I think, or contextual use here.
Yes, so it's Hesed, and I think it's more on the part that it's God's covenant faithfulness. Because in fact, in Jeremiah, for example, he says, "Look, the covenant which you broke, I didn't break it, you broke it." Right? I mean, he's always the covenant keeping God, whatever it is, right? So he keeps his covenant.
Sure, and it broken isn't the language that's used there. It's simply turn. You know, it still exists. It was just directed in a different direction. But the recipient no longer was the recipient.
Correct. Yeah,
So
the covenant is still in play. God is still establishes it, but now it's Saul that's been rejected, as the text says, right? And he's the one who's no longer going to be an active participant in that because of his own sin, his own rebellion.
Right.
Yeah. Good. All right. Very good. All right. If there's not any final comments here, I kind of like, man, this is just kind of my favorite stuff. Is just just sitting here working through the text together. So fantastic evening with you, gentlemen. Always enjoy doing this with you guys. So real quick, you guys should be just tracking with the schedule there. The book summary and response is due not this next week, but the following. It's week 5, right? All right. So, but it's just those chapters that I assigned, so it's not the whole book. Hopefully, you guys are enjoying it. We'll have some discussion from the Moody Handbook there, in particular, dealing with the different approaches to Messianic prophecy. That one chapter there, I find it helpful as it lays out some of the different stuff, and also want to kind of get you guys' thoughts as well as you look at various passages, right? And you see, what's going on with, Isaiah 7 versus Hosea 11, for example, right? And the way it's used in the New Testament, for example, because the New Testament writers will use these texts in different ways, right? So that doesn't mean that they're giving it a new meaning or something. What I mean is they are appropriating these texts for a different purpose in a given text, right? So some interesting nuances there as we look at that. So we'll have some discussion. I'm going to try to allow some time for us to discuss some of that reading there. So I've got that in there. Hopefully we'll do that. You guys have already selected the biblical book that you guys are going to be presenting on there in the last couple weeks there. So just make sure you're kind of working through that. Again, some flexibility there if you want to send the group a little handout, if you want to have a PowerPoint or something. But I'm giving you guys some flexibility. If you kind of give some big pictures summarizing the book as a whole, some of the major themes, structure, whatever. And if you want to kind of do what we're doing tonight, right? Get into let's look at this text here and let's discuss this, key text here, or just this text is whatever issues it raises, so giving you guys some flexibility on that. So just a reminder on that. So does anybody have any questions moving forward assignment wise or paper or anything? So we're basically kind of keeping that the same.
I just wanted to comment that the schedule has the book summary due a week from today.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, whatever it is on the course schedule, that's when that is. Yeah. Yeah. I just couldn't remember off the top of my head if it was next week or the following. Yeah. So whatever the schedule says. So appreciate you looking at that, Jacob. Okay. And so some of you guys went into great detail in your summary responses last time, and that's great because it's really for your benefit that you got a nice tool, that you can go back and kind of, hey, I summarize it. I know what I read, and I know how I respond to that, my thinking through that, and so it's more for your benefit there to have that. So there's no set pages you have to do. So just remind you on that. So I give you guys some freedom on that. Okay. Well, I haven't said that. Thank you guys. Enjoyed it tonight. Mark, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?
Sure. Father, we just pray that you would impress on us and never let us forget what a privilege and an honor it is to be able to spend this time studying your word. And we just pray that by your Spirit you would continue to challenge our minds and thrill our hearts with the truth of your word. This classes like this are exhausting and challenging and a lot of work and a lot of stress. And I know that we're all feeling that, but Father, it's also an opportunity to be refreshed, like trees planted by streams of water, by the life-giving power of your living word. And we just pray that we would experience that as we meet together and have the opportunity to encourage each other and edify each other. So we thank you for this time tonight. We thank you for Dr. Lyon, and we thank you for your presence with us. We just pray that you would strengthen us and give us wisdom for the work that we have in the week ahead. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Appreciate that. Always good to see you, gentlemen. If any guys need to meet up, phone call or anything, send me a text, send me an email. So I think I've got all of y'all's, might have been one of y'all that didn't give me the translation commentary today, but I think I've got everyone else's. So just make sure if you didn't, I've got that. All right, gentlemen, God bless you. I look forward to next week. Let me know if you need anything.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. Good night.
Dr. Lyon, do you have a minute now?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead, Yahweh.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance to talk to you yet about the choosing the passage.
Uh-huh.
So the paper is the same format